Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we move into the quiet edges of New York and New Jersey, where streetlights hum over empty roads and danger doesn't announce itself at all. This is the world of Richard Kuklinski, a man defined by cold patience rather than impulse, where silence was power and emotions were locked far beneath the surface. Most people couldn't survive a life like this, not because of chaos, but because it required living behind a mask every hour of the day, balancing family normalcy with a hidden, relentless darkness. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the world grow quiet, and settle in as we ease into the chilling, controlled story of Richard Kuklinski. The winter air pressed against the streets like a held breath, and in the quiet moments between passing cars, Richard Kuklinski felt the weight of his own thoughts more than the cold. Long before anyone whispered his name, before rumors and stories clung to it like shadows, he was simply a boy learning how silence could be louder than noise. On nights like this, when the city seemed to slow its pulse, he remembered how stillness had always spoken to him, how it had shaped the way he moved through the world. Richard grew up in a house where words were scarce and emotions even scarcer. The walls seemed to listen more than they spoke, and young Richard learned early that attention could be dangerous. He discovered that being unnoticed was a kind of armor. While other children chased laughter and noise, he watched. He studied people the way some study weather, noticing shifts in mood, tension in voices, the unspoken rules that govern behavior. This habit of observation would follow him into adulthood, becoming both his shield and his burden. As he grew older, the streets beyond his neighborhood began to pull at him. They offered structure where his home had offered chaos, and opportunity where he had known only limits. Richard learned how systems worked, how people traded favors, how respect was earned and lost, how trust could be both a currency and a risk. He was never the loudest in the room, never the one demanding attention. Instead, he became the one people overlooked, and in that invisibility, he found a strange sense of control. Work came and went, ordinary jobs that paid the bills but never touched the deeper restlessness inside him. Richard carried himself with discipline, showing up on time, doing what was expected, blending into the rhythm of everyday life. To neighbors and co-workers, he seemed unremarkable, almost forgettable. But beneath that surface, his mind was always active, measuring distances, weighing choices, calculating outcomes. He believed that life rewarded those who understood its rules, even when those rules were unspoken. Marriage and family brought moments of warmth, brief islands of normalcy, where laughter softened the edges of his thoughts. Richard took pride in providing, in being seen as dependable. These moments mattered to him more than he would ever openly admit. They gave him a sense of identity that felt solid, something he could point to and say, "This is real, this is mine." Yet even in these moments, he felt divided, as though part of him stood slightly apart, watching himself play a role. The city around him continued to change, growing louder, faster, more demanding. New faces appeared, some ambitious, some cautious, all trying to find their place. Richard's ability to remain calm in tense situations drew attention from people who valued steadiness over showmanship. Conversations happened quietly, suggestions made without force. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words were measured. People began to see him as reliable, someone who could be trusted to handle difficult matters without drama. Richard told himself he was simply adapting, doing what was necessary to survive and succeed. He believed that control was the key to stability, that understanding and managing outcomes could protect what mattered most. Each decision felt justified in the moment, framed as practical, unavoidable. He avoided thinking too far ahead, focusing instead on the present, on what needed to be done now. Reflection, when it came, was brief and carefully contained. At night, when the house was quiet and the city's noise faded into a distant hum, Richard sometimes sat alone with his thoughts. He considered the paths he had taken, the ones he had ignored, and the thin lines that separated them. He wondered whether people were shaped more by choice or by circumstance, whether control was real or simply an illusion people clung to. These thoughts never lingered long. He had learned how to set them aside, how to return to routine. What Richard did not yet fully grasp was how each small step, each seemingly ordinary decision, was shaping a future that would be impossible to outrun. The habits of observation, silence, and emotional distance that had once protected him were becoming something heavier, something that would demand a reckoning. For now, though, he moved forward as he always had, quietly, deliberately, and convinced that he understood the world well enough to stay ahead of it. As the winter night deepened and the city lights flickered on, Richard Kuklinski stood at the edge of a life that still appeared manageable, still wrapped in the illusion of control. He did not know that the calm he relied on would one day crack, or that the silence he trusted would eventually speak louder than he ever intended. For the moment, there was only the night, the cold air, and a man walking steadily forward, unaware of how closely his own shadow was beginning to follow him. The winter air always seemed to press closer around Richard as he moved through his days, as if the world itself were holding its breath. By the time this chapter of his life began, he had already learned one lesson deeply. Silence could be both armor and prison. He spoke little, listened a lot, and carried his thoughts like sealed envelopes no one else was allowed to open. On the surface, life appeared ordinary, almost dull. He worked, he came home, he followed routines that made him blend in. Yet beneath that calm exterior, his inner world was restless, shaped by years of anger, fear, and a fierce need to feel in control of something, anything. As a boy, Richard had learned early that the world could be harsh and unpredictable. Those memories never left him. They lingered in the background of his adult life, coloring how he interpreted every glance, every raised voice, every perceived slight. He didn't trust easily, and when he did, it was cautious and measured. People, to him, were puzzles with missing pieces. He watched them carefully, studying patterns, noticing habits, filing away details that others ignored. Observation became his way of feeling safe. Yet there was another side to him that rarely surfaced in public. At home, in moments of quiet, he tried to convince himself that normalcy was possible. He wanted structure, rules, and a sense of order. Routine soothed him. Predictability made the days feel manageable. He found comfort in repetition. Same streets, same schedules, same familiar sounds. In those moments, he could almost believe that the storm inside him had settled. But life has a way of testing the stories we tell ourselves. As responsibilities grew and pressures mounted, Richard felt the familiar tension return. He carried it silently, letting it coil tighter with each passing day. He didn't know how to release it safely. He had never learned the language of vulnerability or the relief of asking for help. Strength, as he understood it, meant endurance. Weakness meant exposure. People around him often described him as reserved, maybe even shy. He didn't argue much. He didn't seek attention. He could be polite, even courteous, in small exchanges. This made him easy to overlook, which suited him fine. Being unnoticed felt like freedom. It allowed him to move through life without scrutiny, to keep his inner world hidden and untouched. Yet the contrast between his outward calm and inner turmoil grew sharper over time. He wrestled with impulses he didn't fully understand, emotions that surged without warning. Instead of confronting them, he buried them deeper, convinced that ignoring them was the same as controlling them. He told himself that discipline was enough, that self-command could quiet any storm. For a while, it seemed to work. At night, when the world slowed and the noise faded, Richard lay awake with his thoughts. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams were heavy and unsettled. In those hours, he reflected on power, on fear, on what it meant to be strong in a world that had once made him feel small. He didn't crave admiration or recognition. What he wanted, though he rarely admitted it even to himself, was certainty, a sense that nothing and no one could hurt him again. As the years passed, choices accumulated quietly, like footprints in fresh snow. Each one seemed small on its own, but together they formed a path that was hard to step away from. Richard rarely looked back. He focused forward, telling himself that the past was irrelevant, that only the present moment mattered. Yet the past had a way of resurfacing, shaping reactions, guiding instincts, influencing decisions in ways he didn't fully acknowledge. Those who encountered him during this time might have seen an ordinary man going about his life, carrying groceries, exchanging brief words, standing patiently in line. Few would have guessed how complex and troubled his inner landscape was. He existed in two worlds at once, the visible one everyone shared, and a private one governed by old wounds and unresolved fears. Still, there were moments, brief and fleeting, when Richard sensed the weight of the path he was on. In those moments, he felt a quiet unease, a sense that something was off balance. He pushed those thoughts away quickly. Reflection felt dangerous. It threatened the fragile order he had built. And so he returned to routine, to silence, to the familiar comfort of not asking questions that might demand answers he wasn't ready to face. This was the rhythm of his life during this chapter. Outward calm, inward conflict, days marked by repetition, nights filled with restless thought. The story was still unfolding, shaped by choices made quietly, almost invisibly, each one pulling him further into a future he believed he could control, even as it slowly closed in around him. The winter air always seemed quieter in this part of his life, as if the world itself had learned to hold its breath around Richard. By now, he had mastered the art of appearing ordinary. He woke early, followed routines, and moved through his days with the steady rhythm of someone who belonged exactly where he was. Neighbors saw a man who worked hard, who nodded politely, who carried groceries and fixed small things around the house. To them, Richard was reliable, unremarkable, even comforting in his predictability. Inside, though, his thoughts moved differently. They were careful, measured, and emotionally distant, like footsteps across thin ice. Richard had learned long ago that feelings were unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. Order was safety, control was peace. He structured his inner world the same way he structured his days. Everything in its place, nothing spilling over. At home, he played the role expected of him. He listened more than he spoke, observed more than he reacted. He understood that normal life was built on small moments. Shared meals, quiet evenings, familiar routines. These moments required consistency, and Richard provided it. He was dependable, and dependability earned trust. Trust, he knew, was the strongest disguise of all. But when he was alone, his thoughts drifted backward. Childhood memories came uninvited, like shadows stretching across the walls at night. He rarely lingered on them, but they were always there, shaping the way he saw the world. From an early age, he had learned that strength meant silence and survival meant emotional distance. Compassion, when offered without caution, only invited pain. These lessons had hardened into instincts he no longer questioned. Richard's mind worked like a locked room with labeled drawers. He placed people, situations, and responsibilities into categories, separating what mattered from what did not. This ability to compartmentalize allowed him to move through life without visible strain. Others might have called it discipline. Some might have called it coldness. To Richard, it was simply how things were done. He paid close attention to patterns, how people spoke, how they reacted under stress, how routines shifted over time. Observation had become second nature. It helped him stay ahead of situations, anticipate problems, and maintain control. Control was not about power over others. It was about keeping chaos at bay. Chaos reminded him of earlier years, and he had no desire to return there. There were moments, usually late at night, when the silence felt heavier than usual. The house would settle, the world outside slowing to a near stop, and Richard would sit with his thoughts longer than he intended. In those moments, he wondered, not with regret, but with curiosity, whether his life could have unfolded differently. The thought never stayed long. Wondering was unnecessary. The past could not be revised, and the future demanded focus, not speculation. He took pride in his ability to remain composed. Where others reacted emotionally, he analyzed. Where others hesitated, he decided. This steadiness gave him an advantage in many areas of life, though few understood the cost. Emotional distance protected him, but it also kept him isolated, even in a crowded room. Connections existed, but they were carefully managed, never allowed to reach too deeply. Richard understood appearances better than most. He knew that society rewarded those who fit neatly into expected roles, so he played his part with precision. He dressed appropriately, spoke when necessary, and avoided attention. Being unnoticed was a skill, and he had refined it to near perfection. People rarely questioned what felt familiar and routine. Time moved forward, steady and unremarkable on the surface. Seasons changed, routines adjusted slightly, and life continued its quiet march. Richard adapted as he always did, observing shifts and recalibrating his approach. He believed that life was less about morality and more about navigation, knowing where to step and where not to linger. Yet beneath the controlled exterior, there was a constant vigilance, a sense that one careless moment could unravel everything he had built. This awareness kept him disciplined. He trusted few, spoke carefully, and revealed almost nothing of his inner world. Silence was safer than honesty, distance safer than closeness. As Richard moved through this chapter of his life, he remained what he had always been. A man shaped by restraint, driven by control, and defined by an unshakable need for order. The world saw only what he allowed it to see. A calm surface, steady and unassuming. What lay beneath stayed hidden, carefully contained, as he continued forward, step by deliberate step, into a future he intended to manage just as carefully as his past. The night had a way of settling into Richard's bones, as if darkness itself recognized him and chose to linger. By the time this chapter of his life unfolded, he was no longer just reacting to the world around him. He was shaping it, or at least trying to convince himself that he was. The quiet suburban streets, the trimmed lawns, the gentle glow from living room windows all suggested calm and order. Yet inside him there was a constant hum, a tension that never fully went away. Richard learned early that control was the closest thing to peace he would ever know. When he felt in charge of his surroundings, his thoughts slowed, his breathing steadied. So he built routines. He woke early, worked hard, and returned home at predictable hours. To neighbors, he appeared ordinary, reliable, polite, the kind of man who nodded hello and kept his opinions to himself. That normalcy was not accidental. It was armor carefully crafted and carefully worn. At home, he played a different role, one he believed mattered more than any other. He was a husband, a father, a provider. He fixed broken appliances, attended school events when he could, and made sure there was food on the table. In quiet moments, when the house settled and the children slept, he would sit alone and tell himself that this was the real him. This was the part that counted. Everything else, he insisted, was just noise from a past he couldn't fully escape. Yet the past had a way of resurfacing, uninvited and persistent. Memories of his own childhood drifted in during those quiet hours. Harsh words, heavy silences, lessons learned not through comfort but through fear. He rarely spoke of them, even to himself, but they shaped how he viewed strength and weakness. Vulnerability, in his mind, was a luxury he had never been allowed. Survival had demanded something harder, something colder. As Richard moved through his days, he became skilled at reading people. He noticed the way voices changed when someone was nervous, how eyes lingered when a thought went unspoken. This awareness made him feel prepared, always one step ahead. It also fed a growing sense of separation. He felt different, set apart, as though he were watching life through thick glass while others moved freely on the other side. Despite this, there were moments when he longed for simplicity. Watching his children laugh, hearing their careless joy, he wondered what it might be like to live without the constant vigilance that defined him. Those moments never lasted long. Reality, with all its demands and pressures, always returned. And when it did, Richard retreated inward, relying on the familiar structure of discipline and control. Work became another place where he could focus his energy. He took pride in being dependable, in doing what was asked without complaint. Employers trusted him. Colleagues respected him. Each small affirmation reinforced the image he had built. A man who could be counted on, a man who didn't cause trouble. That trust, once earned, became another layer of protection, another reason no one looked too closely. Still, beneath the surface there was a growing strain. Holding two versions of himself in place required constant effort. The careful balance left him exhausted in ways sleep could not fix. On long drives, alone with the road stretching endlessly ahead, his thoughts wandered. He questioned whether people truly knew him or whether anyone ever could. The answer, he suspected, was no. Richard rarely spoke about fear, but it lived with him. Not fear of others, but fear of losing control, of being exposed, of everything he had built unraveling. That fear made him cautious, deliberate. He chose his words carefully, avoided unnecessary risks, and stayed within routines that felt safe. In his mind, predictability equaled security. Yet life has a way of testing even the strongest routines. Subtle changes began to creep in. Unexpected questions, moments that demanded explanations. Each one tightened the knot inside him. He responded by becoming quieter, more guarded. To those around him, he seemed serious, maybe distant, but still reliable. No one saw the calculations running constantly through his mind. In private, Richard justified his choices with a logic that felt unshakable. He told himself he was doing what he had to do to survive, to protect what mattered most. The world, he believed, was harsh and unforgiving. He had simply learned how to navigate it better than most. Right and wrong became flexible concepts, shaped by circumstance rather than principle. As the years passed, the weight of this thinking grew heavier. There were nights when sleep wouldn't come, when the silence felt too loud. During those hours, he confronted questions he usually kept buried. Was he truly in control, or was he trapped by the very patterns he relied on? Could a man choose who he became, or was he forever shaped by where he started? Richard never shared these doubts. He locked them away, the same way he locked away every other uncomfortable truth. To admit uncertainty felt dangerous. Certainty, even false certainty, was safer. It gave him direction, something solid to hold on to in a world that often felt unpredictable. This part of his life was defined by tension rather than action, by the quiet struggle between image and reality. From the outside, everything appeared stable. Inside, the pressure continued to build, unseen and unresolved. Richard walked forward, step by careful step, convinced that as long as he maintained control, everything else would fall into place. But beneath that conviction was an unspoken awareness. Control could slip, routines could break, and secrets, no matter how well hidden, had a way of surfacing. And as this chapter closed, Richard sensed, though he refused to acknowledge it, that the balance he depended on was more fragile than he wanted to believe, and that the next turn in his story would test him in ways he was not yet ready to face. The years that followed brought a strange quiet to Richard's life. The kind of quiet that settles in when the outside world keeps moving but something inside begins to slow. From the outside, he looked like a man who had found his rhythm. He worked, he came home, he followed routines that appeared ordinary enough to blend into the background. Neighbors saw a man who kept to himself, someone predictable, even dull. That was exactly how Richard preferred it. Yet beneath that still surface, his thoughts were constantly in motion. He had spent so long living in survival mode that stillness felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous. Silence gave his memories room to speak, and he wasn't always comfortable with what they said. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the world felt far away, he would sit alone and reflect on the long road that had led him there. He often thought about how early lessons shape a person, how fear, when learned young, can grow into something powerful and difficult to unlearn. Richard had built his life on control, believing that strength meant never appearing weak, never allowing vulnerability. It was a belief that had guided many of his choices, for better or worse, and now it followed him like a shadow. At home, he played the role expected of him, trying to be present, trying to fit into a version of life that demanded patience and emotional openness. But connection didn't come easily. He loved in his own guarded way, measured and restrained, unsure how to express feelings that had been buried under years of emotional armor. The distance he felt from others wasn't always intentional, but it was familiar, and familiarity felt safe. Richard began to notice how time changes perception. Moments that once felt urgent now seemed distant, their intensity dulled by years of repetition and reflection. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that consequences weren't always immediate. Sometimes they arrived slowly, quietly, building weight over time until they could no longer be ignored. The world around him was also changing. News traveled faster, scrutiny increased, and the sense of anonymity he once relied on began to fade. He felt it in subtle ways, a lingering glance, a question that carried more curiosity than necessary, an unspoken tension in ordinary interactions. It reminded him that no one moves through life entirely unseen forever. Instead of reacting, Richard withdrew further into routine. Routine had always been his anchor. Wake, work, return, repeat. Predictability offered comfort, a sense of control in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. Each day followed the last with deliberate sameness, as if consistency itself could hold chaos at bay. But even routines evolve. Small cracks appeared, moments of fatigue, lapses in focus, the growing weight of years spent holding everything tightly inside. Richard felt the limits of his own endurance. Control required energy, and energy, he realized, was not infinite. He found himself thinking more about legacy, though not in grand terms. Not fame or recognition, but the quieter idea of how a life is remembered by those closest to it. He wondered what stories people would tell, what moments would stand out, what silences would speak louder than words. These thoughts unsettled him, because they forced him to confront parts of himself he had long avoided. There were nights when sleep didn't come easily. On those nights, Richard would sit with his thoughts, listening to the soft hum of the world outside. He realized that the strongest walls are often built inward, and dismantling them can feel more frightening than building them ever did. Still, awareness had begun to replace denial, and that shift, though uncomfortable, was significant. He began to understand that strength could take different forms. Not just dominance or control, but restraint, accountability, and the courage to face one's own reflection honestly. These realizations didn't come all at once. They arrived slowly, in fragments, often uninvited, but persistent. As the years pressed on, Richard's life became less about movement and more about waiting. Waiting for clarity, waiting for change, waiting for something he couldn't quite name. The past no longer felt distant, but neither did the future feel certain. He existed in a narrow space between what had been and what could no longer be undone. And in that space, Richard Kuklinski sat quietly with his thoughts, aware that every life, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually reaches a point of reckoning. Not always in dramatic moments, but often in silence, reflection, and the slow understanding that time, once spent, never returns. Richard Kuklinski had by now settled into a life defined by meticulous planning and careful observation. The streets of New Jersey, with their shifting patterns and hidden currents, had become his arena, a place where every movement, every conversation, and every interaction carried meaning. He had learned to see beyond the obvious, to notice subtleties that others overlooked, and to anticipate events before they unfolded. His reputation as a calm, calculated presence had grown steadily, though it was one built not on spectacle, but on quiet mastery. Richard's daily life had become a balance of discipline, observation, and strategic engagement. He maintained routines that reinforced clarity and focus. Mornings were spent in reflection, walking through familiar neighborhoods, observing patterns of behavior, and noting subtle changes in the environment. He had discovered that the city itself was alive, moving and responding like an organism, and he was increasingly adept at reading its rhythms. His network of relationships was carefully curated. Friends, acquaintances, and allies were chosen not for fleeting loyalty or empty charm, but for reliability, discretion, and alignment with his long-term vision. Trust was fragile and had to be cultivated continuously. Richard observed behavior with a meticulous eye, noting inconsistencies, hesitations, and unspoken concerns. He understood that actions revealed far more than words ever could, and he relied on these insights to guide interactions, resolve conflicts, and strengthen bonds. In conversations, Richard had developed the art of listening on multiple levels. He heard not just the words but the intent behind them, the pauses between sentences, the subtle shifts in tone. This sensitivity allowed him to anticipate reactions, adjust strategies, and guide outcomes without ever forcing them. People often left discussions with him feeling understood and respected, unaware that their behavior had been gently guided by his careful observation. Timing had become a critical element of his influence. Richard understood that patience often carried more power than immediate action. By waiting for the right moment, he could maximize impact and minimize risk. This approach required self-discipline and emotional control, traits he had cultivated over years of experience. Impulsivity, he knew, was the enemy of strategy. Calm, measured action was the key to lasting influence. The city around him provided constant lessons. New people arrived with ambition, old faces faded, and alliances shifted subtly over time. Richard adapted to these changes without losing his sense of direction. Visibility was a double-edged sword. Too much drew attention, too little invited oversight. He learned to maintain just enough presence to guide events while remaining flexible and unpredictable. His subtlety became his most powerful tool. Richard's approach to personal discipline extended beyond professional interactions. He maintained a strict regimen that kept his mind sharp and his focus intact. Leisure was purposeful. Observation continued even in quiet moments, and reflection was a constant companion. This discipline allowed him to navigate complexity, anticipate challenges, and respond to opportunities with precision. Observation had become instinctual. Richard could read the environment, the social cues, and the behaviors of those around him almost unconsciously. Subtle gestures, changes in tone, and fleeting expressions conveyed more than words, and he had mastered the ability to interpret and act upon these signals. This skill gave him an edge in every interaction, allowing him to guide outcomes without confrontation or overt control. He also nurtured the understanding that influence was cumulative. Every action, every choice, every interaction contributed to a broader tapestry of control and trust. Patience, consistency, and subtle guidance reinforced his position over time. Richard had learned that overt displays of power often generated resistance, while quiet, deliberate influence earned loyalty and respect that endured. Strategic thinking extended to long-term planning. Richard evaluated not only immediate consequences but also ripple effects that might unfold over months or years. He anticipated how relationships, decisions, and social dynamics would evolve, using this foresight to position himself advantageously. His ability to think several steps ahead allowed him to maintain stability amid a constantly shifting environment. Human psychology became a central component of his strategy. Richard observed how people responded to pressure, uncertainty, and perceived authority. He used these insights to predict behavior, mitigate conflicts, and reinforce loyalty. Subtle adjustments in approach often yielded far greater results than overt intervention, and he refined these techniques over time, developing an intuitive understanding of influence and human behavior. Despite the growth of his reputation and network, Richard remained grounded. Family and close personal relationships provided stability and perspective. These connections reminded him of his values and offered a framework within which he could exercise judgment responsibly. He maintained these bonds deliberately, understanding that personal grounding strengthened public influence. He had also learned the importance of restraint and subtlety. Not every opportunity required immediate action. Not every conflict demanded resolution. Knowing when to act and when to observe became a hallmark of his approach. Restraint amplified his influence, allowing him to conserve energy and maintain flexibility, while others acted impulsively and revealed their positions prematurely. Richard's awareness of his surroundings extended beyond individual interactions to larger environmental and social patterns. He noticed shifts in commerce, social behavior, and neighborhood dynamics. These patterns informed his strategies, allowing him to position himself advantageously, anticipate challenges, and guide outcomes in ways that seemed natural to those around him. By now, he had become a figure whose influence was subtle yet pervasive, commanding respect without demanding it, guiding outcomes without overt interference. He had mastered the art of strategic patience, careful observation, and deliberate engagement. Every step, every decision, every gesture reinforced his position, strengthened alliances, and ensured that his presence remained, both stabilizing and guiding. The city itself became a partner in his strategies. Richard observed its rhythms, understood its patterns, and integrated this knowledge into his actions. He moved through it with confidence, shaping outcomes quietly, yet decisively. People responded to him because they trusted his judgment, respected his consistency, and felt secure under his influence. Even as he managed the complexities of his environment, Richard reflected continuously on his own growth and identity. He evaluated past actions, assessed motives, and refined strategies. He recognized that influence was as much about internal discipline and self-awareness as it was about external control. His introspection allowed him to remain adaptable, perceptive, and consistently effective in guiding outcomes. By this stage, Richard Kuklinski had evolved into a master of presence, timing, and influence. He moved through the city with an understanding that true power was subtle, enduring, and cumulative. His reputation, relationships, and strategies were all carefully cultivated, creating a foundation of lasting respect and authority. The streets of New Jersey had become both his classroom and his canvas, and he had learned to navigate their complexity with precision, patience, and skill. His life was a testament to the power of observation, strategic patience, and the quiet mastery of influence. Richard's ability to guide outcomes without forcing them, to shape behavior without confrontation, and to maintain consistency in a changing world had become the defining elements of his existence. Each decision, interaction, and moment of restraint contributed to a legacy built not on spectacle, but on enduring skill, insight, and strategic awareness. Richard Kuklinski's life, by this stage, had become a delicate symphony of observation, strategy, and influence. Every day, every interaction, every subtle gesture contributed to a carefully woven network of understanding and control that allowed him to navigate the complexities of New Jersey with remarkable precision. The city itself seemed alive to him, a living entity whose rhythms, patterns, and hidden currents offered insight into human behavior, opportunity, and risk. Jack, or rather Richard, had learned to listen to these rhythms with a keen ear and a patient mind, treating every detail as meaningful, every minor shift as a clue to the larger dynamics at play. Richard's reputation had grown quietly yet profoundly. People noticed him not for loud proclamations or flashy displays, but for the calm assurance he projected, the meticulous way he approached situations, and the careful attention he paid to the details that others often overlooked. Those who had worked with him, even peripherally, began to understand that he had a way of being present that influenced outcomes subtly. A word, a pause, a glance. These small actions carried more weight than any overt command, more impact than any show of force. His power lay not in spectacle but in the quiet mastery of perception. By now, his network of relationships was extensive yet carefully maintained. Friends, allies, and associates were chosen for reliability, discretion, and alignment with long-term vision rather than fleeting loyalty or empty charm. Trust was a fragile and invaluable currency in Richard's world, and he spent an extraordinary amount of time observing, evaluating, and nurturing it. Every interaction, every minor exchange, was carefully monitored to ensure consistency and authenticity. He knew that even the smallest breach of trust could ripple outward, unraveling relationships painstakingly built over years. Richard's ability to read people had become almost preternatural. He could interpret subtle changes in posture, tone, or word choice, discerning intent, hesitation, and underlying emotions with remarkable accuracy. These observations informed his decisions, allowing him to anticipate behavior and guide outcomes without ever imposing overt control. People often left interactions with him feeling heard, understood, and subtly guided, unaware of the invisible hand shaping their choices. It was a skill born of decades of careful observation, reflection, and practice, a skill that became the cornerstone of his influence. Timing, as ever, was critical. Richard understood that patience often carried far more power than immediate action. Waiting for the right moment allowed him to maximize influence, minimize risk, and achieve outcomes that seemed natural rather than forced. This patience required extraordinary self-discipline and emotional control. Impulsivity, he knew, was the enemy of strategy. By maintaining calm and measured responses, he could steer situations, shape perceptions, and maintain control without revealing the careful orchestration behind his every move. The city, for all its seeming chaos, provided constant lessons. New people emerged, old alliances shifted, and opportunities appeared in unexpected forms. Richard had learned to adapt without losing his sense of direction. Visibility was carefully managed. Being seen too clearly could make him predictable, while being absent could invite oversight or misalignment. He had mastered the balance, maintaining enough presence to guide events while preserving flexibility and unpredictability. His subtlety had become his most potent tool, a weapon far more effective than overt displays of force. Discipline extended into every aspect of his life. Richard maintained strict routines to preserve mental clarity and focus. Daily reflection, quiet walks through familiar neighborhoods, and deliberate observation allowed him to process complex social dynamics, identify patterns, and refine strategies. Leisure was purposeful, designed not as a distraction but as a space for contemplation and insight. This rigor provided a foundation upon which all influence, decision-making, and long-term planning rested. Observation was now instinctual. Richard could interpret the city, its people, and its social rhythms almost without conscious effort. Subtle gestures, fleeting expressions, minor tonal shifts. These small details spoke volumes about intention, reliability, and potential outcomes. He learned to act on these signals with precision, shaping outcomes without confrontation and guiding behavior without overt control. This skill, honed over years of experience, made him a master strategist in every interaction, whether personal, social, or professional. The cumulative nature of influence had become clear to him. Every action, every decision, every interaction built upon the previous one, creating a tapestry of control, trust, and reputation. Richard understood that overt displays of power often generated resistance, whereas subtle, consistent guidance produced loyalty and stability that endured. Patience and consistency had become his greatest assets, allowing him to build a network of relationships and influence that was resilient and far-reaching. Long-term strategic thinking now dominated his approach. Richard considered not only the immediate consequences of a decision but also its ripple effects over months or years. By anticipating the evolution of social dynamics, relationships, and opportunities, he positioned himself advantageously, maintaining stability while others reacted impulsively. His foresight allowed him to navigate a constantly shifting environment with clarity, control, and precision. Richard's understanding of human behavior had grown sophisticated. He studied how people responded to success, failure, pressure, and authority. Subtle changes in demeanor or tone could reveal hidden motivations, insecurities, or ambitions. By interpreting these signals accurately, Richard could guide outcomes in a way that minimized conflict, reinforced loyalty, and maintained alignment with long-term goals. His mastery of subtle influence allowed him to orchestrate events quietly and effectively. Despite his increasing influence, Richard remained grounded. Family and close relationships offered stability, perspective, and emotional clarity. These connections reinforced his sense of self and provided a framework within which he could exercise judgment responsibly. Richard understood that personal grounding strengthened public influence and ensured that his strategies were rooted in both insight and integrity. Restraint was central to Richard's approach. Not every opportunity required immediate action, and not every challenge demanded intervention. Knowing when to act and when to observe amplified his influence, conserving energy, preserving flexibility, and avoiding unnecessary conflicts. This mastery of restraint reinforced his reputation for calm, measured authority, allowing him to guide outcomes without drawing attention to himself. Richard's awareness extended beyond people to broader social and environmental patterns. He observed shifts in commerce, community behavior, and social networks, integrating these observations into his strategic thinking. By understanding the subtle forces shaping the city, he could anticipate changes, preempt challenges, and seize opportunities that others overlooked. His influence was not imposed but cultivated, growing organically from his understanding of the interconnected systems around him. By now, Richard Kuklinski had become a figure whose influence was pervasive yet invisible. He guided outcomes, shaped behavior, and maintained stability not through force, but through perception, patience, and subtle intervention. He had mastered the art of quiet power, moving through New Jersey with foresight, discretion, and strategic patience. His reputation, relationships, and strategies were all carefully cultivated, forming a foundation of enduring authority and respect. Even as the environment shifted around him, Richard's approach remained consistent. He navigated challenges with foresight, maintained alliances with subtle guidance, and used observation to anticipate developments before they became critical. Influence in his world was less about domination and more about careful orchestration, guiding events, shaping perception, and positioning oneself advantageously while maintaining trust and credibility. At this stage of his life, Richard's mastery of subtle influence, patient strategy, and disciplined observation had become the defining features of his existence. He moved through the city as both participant and orchestrator, shaping outcomes quietly but decisively. Every interaction, every decision, and every gesture reinforced his presence, strengthened relationships, and ensured that his influence endured. His life had become a testament to the power of patience, insight, and careful strategy, demonstrating that true mastery lies not in force or spectacle, but in subtle, sustained, and deliberate action. Richard Kuklinski's life, at this point, had grown into a tapestry of careful strategy, patient observation, and subtle influence. The streets of New Jersey no longer seemed chaotic or unpredictable to him. They were patterns, puzzles, and rhythms that he had learned to read with near-perfect precision. Every neighborhood, every intersection, every social interaction carried signals, hints, and implications that, when interpreted correctly, provided insight into the people around him and the environment in which he operated. Over the years, Richard had developed a keen sense of anticipation, learning to see opportunities before they appeared and challenges before they became crises. His reputation, cultivated with deliberate care, had become almost intangible but deeply felt. People did not need to know him personally to recognize his influence. There was a quiet power in the way he carried himself, the calm assurance in his decisions, and the unwavering discipline he exhibited. This authority was not forced. It was absorbed, acknowledged, and respected by those who sensed his capacity for foresight and consistency. Richard had come to understand that the most profound influence is often invisible, operating under the surface, guiding outcomes without ever announcing itself. Central to his success was his meticulous approach to relationships. Every person he interacted with was observed, evaluated, and understood on multiple levels. Allies were chosen not for immediate advantage but for reliability, loyalty, and alignment with long-term objectives. Richard understood that trust was fragile and could be broken by a single misstep. Therefore, he invested in understanding motivations, monitoring behaviors, and ensuring that interactions reinforced stability and mutual respect. Those who became part of his network did so through a combination of demonstrated reliability and careful cultivation, creating a resilient web of connections that extended far beyond what was immediately visible. Richard's skill in reading people had evolved into an almost instinctive ability. He could detect subtle shifts in tone, micro-expressions, hesitations, and gestures that revealed intentions, concerns, or hidden agendas. These observations were invaluable, allowing him to anticipate reactions, navigate complex social landscapes, and guide outcomes without overt control. People often left interactions with him feeling understood and respected, unaware that they had been influenced through subtle cues and strategic guidance. It was a mastery born of decades of experience, patience, and careful attention to human behavior. Timing had become one of Richard's most potent tools. He understood that patience often carried more weight than immediate action. By waiting for the optimal moment, he could maximize impact, minimize risk, and achieve outcomes that appeared natural rather than imposed. This approach required immense self-discipline and emotional regulation. Richard had learned that impulsivity was the enemy of strategy. While calm, measured responses allowed him to guide situations effectively and consistently. The city itself offered endless lessons. New people emerged, old alliances shifted, and opportunities appeared in unexpected forms. Richard adapted to these changes with a combination of flexibility and steadfastness. He carefully managed his visibility, understanding that too much exposure made one predictable, while too little invited oversight or misinterpretation. He had mastered the balance, maintaining a presence sufficient to guide events while preserving the flexibility to act strategically when needed. His subtlety had become one of his greatest assets, allowing him to exert influence without overt displays of power. Discipline permeated every aspect of his life. Daily routines reinforced clarity and focus. Mornings were spent observing, reflecting, and planning. Leisure was purposeful, used as a space for contemplation, observation, and refinement of strategies. Richard avoided distractions and indulgences that could cloud judgment. This rigorous self-discipline provided a foundation upon which his influence, relationships, and long-term plans rested. Observation had become second nature to Richard. He noticed micro-changes in his environment, subtle shifts in social behavior, and minor cues in interpersonal interactions that revealed larger patterns. These observations informed his decisions and allowed him to act decisively when necessary. His ability to interpret signals and respond strategically became a hallmark of his approach, enabling him to influence outcomes subtly and effectively. Richard had also developed an acute understanding of cumulative influence. Every action, every decision, every interaction built upon previous ones, creating a network of trust, credibility, and respect. He understood that overt displays of power often led to resistance, whereas quiet, consistent guidance fostered loyalty and stability. Patience and consistency were his greatest assets, allowing him to shape long-term outcomes in a world that often valued immediate gratification. Long-term strategic thinking dominated Richard's approach. He evaluated not only immediate consequences but also ripple effects that might emerge over months or years. By anticipating shifts in relationships, social dynamics, and opportunities, he positioned himself advantageously while maintaining stability and adaptability. His foresight allowed him to navigate a constantly changing environment with clarity and control, avoiding pitfalls that others might not see. Richard's knowledge of human behavior under pressure was exceptional. He studied how people responded to stress, ambition, and perceived authority. By interpreting subtle cues, he could guide actions, predict outcomes, and reinforce loyalty without the need for confrontation. His mastery of subtle influence allowed him to orchestrate situations quietly, ensuring that outcomes aligned with his long-term objectives while maintaining trust and credibility. Even as his influence grew, Richard remained grounded through personal relationships. Family and close friends provided perspective, stability, and emotional clarity. These connections reminded him of his values and offered a counterbalance to the pressures of his broader environment. He maintained these relationships with intention, understanding that personal grounding strengthened his public influence and ensured thoughtful decision-making. Restraint and selective action were central to Richard's approach. He knew that not every opportunity required immediate intervention and not every challenge demanded resolution. Exercising restraint amplified his influence, conserved energy, and preserved the flexibility to act decisively when the situation truly required it. This approach reinforced his reputation for calm, measured authority, and allowed him to guide events with precision. Richard's understanding of environmental and social patterns extended beyond individual interactions. He observed economic, social, and community trends, integrating these insights into his strategic thinking. By understanding the subtle forces shaping neighborhoods and networks, he anticipated challenges, identified opportunities, and guided outcomes in ways that appeared organic to those around him. Influence, in his world was cultivated through observation, patience, and thoughtful intervention rather than coercion or spectacle. By now, Richard Kuklinski had become a figure of pervasive but subtle influence, a man whose decisions and presence shaped outcomes quietly yet effectively. He guided situations, molded perceptions, and maintained stability not through force but through perception, patience, and strategic action. His mastery of timing, observation, and restraint had become the defining features of his life, allowing him to navigate a complex, ever-changing environment with consistent success. At this stage, Richard's life demonstrated that true power lies not in overt displays or immediate gains, but in the careful orchestration of influence over time. His ability to read people, anticipate change, and act with precision had created a foundation of trust, respect, and enduring authority. Every choice, every interaction, and every moment of patience reinforced his presence and shaped the environment around him, leaving a legacy built on strategy, insight, and quiet mastery. Richard Kuklinski's life had by now evolved into a delicate and intricate network of observation, strategy, and influence. By this point, he had developed a profound understanding of the subtle dynamics that governed both people and environments, a mastery that allowed him to navigate his world with extraordinary precision. New Jersey, with its shifting social landscapes, unpredictable interactions, and hidden currents of opportunity and risk, had become his arena. Every street, every neighborhood, every fleeting interaction was a potential signal, a clue, or an opening. For Richard, the city was alive, a living organism whose patterns could be read, interpreted, and, when necessary, gently guided. He had come to understand that influence was cumulative. It was not earned through a single grand gesture or an overt display of power, but through consistent, deliberate action over time. Every word, every gesture, every interaction added a thread to the intricate web of his influence, reinforcing trust, credibility, and respect. This subtle accumulation of authority allowed him to guide outcomes without coercion, to shape perceptions without force, and to maintain stability in a world that was often chaotic and unpredictable. Richard's reputation was now deeply rooted in the perception of calm, measured authority. People felt the weight of his presence even when he did not speak. His influence was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. Those who worked with him, whether directly or indirectly, often felt guided, their actions aligned with his vision even if they were unaware of it. He had learned that true mastery lay not in being seen as powerful but in being understood as wise, reliable, and insightful. The most enduring influence, he realized, was invisible, operating beneath the surface and shaping outcomes through perception rather than coercion. Central to Richard's approach was his unparalleled skill in understanding human behavior. He could read subtle shifts in tone, posture, or expression, detecting hesitation, intent, or concealed emotion. These microsignals provided him with critical information that allowed him to anticipate actions, guide interactions, and influence outcomes quietly yet effectively. Over the years, this skill had become instinctive, a second nature that allowed him to operate several steps ahead of those around him. People often left his presence feeling validated and respected, unaware of the careful orchestration that had guided their behavior. Timing remained one of his most powerful tools. Richard understood that patience often carried far greater weight than immediate action. By waiting for the right moment, he could maximize impact, reduce risk, and achieve results that seemed organic and inevitable rather than forced. Impulsivity was a danger he had long since learned to avoid, understanding that it could undermine years of careful planning and observation. Calm, deliberate action became the hallmark of his approach, reinforcing both his effectiveness and his reputation for wisdom. His network of relationships had grown extensive, yet it remained carefully maintained. Each connection was evaluated for reliability, discretion, and alignment with long-term objectives. Trust was a rare and precious commodity, and Richard safeguarded it vigilantly. Even minor inconsistencies in behavior or loyalty were noted, analyzed, and addressed with subtlety. Those who formed part of his circle did so because they had demonstrated reliability over time, and their continued inclusion was contingent on maintaining alignment with the principles he valued. Richard's discipline extended beyond his social interactions into every aspect of his life. Daily routines reinforced mental clarity, focus, and strategic thinking. Reflection, careful observation, and purposeful action were constants in his days. Leisure was intentional, offering space for contemplation, refinement of strategies, and the observation of patterns in his environment. He understood that maintaining internal discipline was essential to sustaining influence, and he adhered rigorously to habits that reinforced clarity and control. Observation had become instinctual. Richard noticed patterns in human behavior, environmental cues, and social dynamics that would elude most people. These observations informed his decisions, allowed him to anticipate challenges, and enabled him to guide outcomes with subtlety and precision. Small shifts in tone, fleeting expressions, and minor gestures often revealed more than explicit words, and Richard had developed the ability to interpret and act on these signals in real time. His mastery of observation was a key factor in his enduring influence. Richard also understood the importance of restraint. Not every challenge required immediate intervention, and not every opportunity demanded exploitation. Knowing when to act and when to observe amplified his influence, conserved energy, and allowed him to respond strategically when circumstances were most favorable. This careful balance of action and restraint reinforced his reputation for calm authority and enhanced his capacity to shape outcomes effectively. His long-term strategic thinking became increasingly sophisticated. He considered not only immediate consequences but also the broader ripple effects of decisions over months and years. By anticipating shifts in relationships, social networks, and environmental patterns, he positioned himself advantageously, maintaining stability while others reacted impulsively. This foresight allowed him to navigate a constantly evolving landscape with confidence and precision. Richard's understanding of human psychology was nuanced and profound. He observed how individuals responded to pressure, success, failure, and perceived authority. By interpreting these behavioral cues, he could predict actions, guide decisions, and reinforce loyalty without overt coercion. His approach to influence was both subtle and effective, allowing him to orchestrate outcomes quietly while maintaining credibility and trust. Despite his growing influence, Richard remained grounded. Family and personal relationships provided stability, perspective, and emotional clarity. These connections reminded him of his values and offered a framework within which he could exercise judgment responsibly. Maintaining these relationships intentionally ensured that his influence was balanced by perspective, empathy, and accountability. Richard's awareness extended beyond individuals to broader social and environmental patterns. He observed economic trends, neighborhood dynamics, and shifts in social behavior, integrating these insights into his strategies. By understanding the larger forces at play, he could anticipate challenges, seize opportunities, and guide outcomes in ways that appeared natural and inevitable to those around him. His influence was cultivated through observation, insight, and strategic action rather than force or spectacle. By now, Richard Kuklinski had become a figure whose influence was pervasive yet subtle. He shaped behavior, guided outcomes, and maintained stability not through force but through perception, patience, and careful orchestration. His mastery of timing, observation, and restraint allowed him to navigate complexity with clarity and control, earning trust, respect, and enduring authority. At this stage, Richard's life exemplified the power of patient, strategic influence. He had learned to anticipate, observe, and act with precision. Every interaction, decision, and gesture contributed to a foundation of trust, credibility, and subtle authority. His story became a testament to the power of observation, strategic patience, and disciplined action, showing that true mastery lies not in overt control or spectacle, but in the quiet, persistent, and thoughtful shaping of the world around him. Richard Kuklinski's life, as it approached its later chapters, had become a study in the quiet power of observation, patience, and strategic influence. By this stage, he had come to understand that life itself was less about the visible events and more about the subtle currents that underlay them. Every interaction, every relationship, every movement in his environment was a thread in a vast, interconnected web. He had learned to read these threads, to anticipate their direction, and to act when the moment was right, always with subtlety, always with care. Richard's reputation had solidified as one of calm authority. People responded to him not because they feared him, but because they trusted him. They sensed a clarity of judgment, a steadiness of purpose, and a consistency in behavior that created confidence and respect. In the world he had navigated for decades, these traits were more powerful than any display of force or bravado. Influence, he had discovered, was most enduring when it was invisible, woven seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life. By now, his network was both extensive and resilient. Relationships had been built over years with careful attention to reliability, discretion, and mutual respect. Trust was the currency he valued most, and he managed it with meticulous care. Every alliance was nurtured, every interaction calibrated to reinforce stability and understanding. Richard had learned that influence was cumulative. Each choice, each gesture, each word contributed to a larger pattern that would shape outcomes long after the moment had passed. Even in these later years, Richard remained disciplined. His daily routines of observation, reflection, and contemplation reinforced mental clarity and focus. Leisure was purposeful, offering opportunities to refine strategies, observe subtleties, and process the complexities of human behavior. Through this consistent discipline, he maintained a sharpness of perception that allowed him to respond to changes with measured precision. Observation had become instinctive. He could read micro-expressions, tonal shifts, and gestures to interpret intentions and predict behavior. These subtle cues, often unnoticed by others, provided him with the information necessary to guide outcomes effectively. This mastery allowed him to influence events without confrontation or force, relying instead on anticipation, guidance, and careful timing. Patience remained his most powerful tool. Richard understood that the most impactful decisions often required waiting for the right circumstances. By exercising restraint, he could maximize the effectiveness of his actions, maintain flexibility, and avoid unnecessary risks. This careful balance between action and observation allowed him to navigate even the most complex situations with calm assurance. His understanding of human psychology had reached a high level of sophistication. He could anticipate reactions to stress, authority, and opportunity, and he used this insight to guide interactions with subtlety and effectiveness. His influence was rooted not in domination but in understanding, perception, and strategic engagement. People often felt guided without realizing the invisible hand that shaped their decisions. Even as he managed his network and navigated complex environments, Richard remained grounded through personal relationships. Family and close friends provided perspective and emotional clarity, anchoring him in a reality beyond strategy and influence. These connections reminded him of the importance of values, empathy, and integrity, reinforcing the foundation upon which all his actions rested. Richard's awareness extended beyond immediate interactions to broader patterns in society and environment. Economic shifts, social trends, and community dynamics informed his understanding of the world and allowed him to anticipate changes and guide outcomes with foresight. His influence was holistic, integrated into both the social fabric and the larger environment, shaping events subtly yet effectively. In his later years, Richard Kuklinski became a master of life itself. His legacy was not defined by spectacle or notoriety, but by the quiet, enduring impact he had on those around him and the environment he navigated. He had demonstrated that true mastery lay in observation, patience, and the subtle orchestration of influence. Every interaction, every choice, every calculated gesture contributed to a life of enduring presence, insight, and authority. Ultimately, Richard's story was one of quiet mastery. He had learned to observe, to anticipate, and to act with precision. His life exemplified the power of patience, strategic thought, and disciplined engagement, showing that influence and authority are most effective when they are subtle, sustained, and thoughtful. By the end, Richard Kuklinski's legacy was not measured in outward displays or immediate power, but in the enduring mark of wisdom, perception, and strategic mastery he left on the world around him. The city moved on around him, ever-changing and alive, but Richard had mastered the rhythm of it. Through observation, restraint, and insight, he had shaped a life that was both impactful and enduring. A life defined by the quiet power of strategic thought, patient action, and subtle influence. And as the sun set over the streets of New Jersey, Richard's presence remained felt, not through spectacle, but through the invisible threads of wisdom and guidance he had woven into the very fabric of the world he had navigated so masterfully.